English translation, 503rd contact. Thursday, 9th of September 2010, 22:50 hours.
Greetings, dear friend Eduard.
I am glad you still came so we could continue our work on the Talmud. But welcome and greetings, dear friend.
Because Ava was still present, I had to wait a little longer, but when it got too long, I had to do something to get her to leave your workroom.
I see. That's why she was in such a hurry to leave all of a sudden. But right at the beginning, I would like to ask if you discussed the matter with Quetzal regarding the German language.
Of course, but I did not leave it at that because we discussed your request with all our group members.
You mean with your committee advising on our affairs?
That is the meaning of my words, to which I can go on to say that our decision is that you should make the German language the language of the association. This should be the case in the whole world, in every other language respectively, in every not German-speaking country.
You mean that German should be the Figu language for the whole world, so to speak?
Yes, that is to be understood. It should be arranged that all Figu groupings worldwide, on the one hand, have their group names in German only. For example, Figu Studiengruppe Italien or Figu Landesgruppe Italien, etc. On the other hand, it should be an unavoidable obligation of all groupings for their members to learn the German language thoroughly in written and oral form. It would probably be important that the individual groups agree on appropriate learning courses with a necessary specialist respectively teaching teacher, as you also once established with regard to English in the core group. You should discuss this next time in a meeting and then make the correct decisions, because the longer and longer the more it becomes necessary that all those who deal with textbooks and learning books, as well as with the spiritual teachings in other countries, do this in German, because only in German everything is understood correctly.
It will probably be possible that with a little sensitivity, I can start a conversation about it, so that we can then talk about it and make the necessary decisions.
A fruitful development in this respect would be in line with our recommendation. There is, however, something else we have discussed, namely the form of voting on any matters that need to be voted on. In the core group, you use the same system as we do, that a decision requires unanimity of all members present. So it would be good if all Figu groups worldwide would apply this system equally.
In my opinion, such a voting process outside the core group is not possible at present in other Figu groupings, because the human beings of the earth have always believed that the majority of votes is the decisive factor for passing a resolution. This, of course, puts every minority at a disadvantage, which also leads to a constant disagreement between the supporters and the opponents, which often leads to strife, hate and anger, and even to fisticuffs, and not seldom to very bad riots and irreparable consequences.
We have also considered this, and appreciate that you will also present this argumentation.
All right then. Is that all is clear, and we can get on with our work now? But it is really very exhausting and laborious to revise the Talmud.
Indeed, it is a difficult but very important work. But before we turn to it, I would like to tell you what I have found out about the family tree of the Meyer von Bulach, and also about you. As we have both already suspected, the lineage leads back to Emmanuel and ultimately to the Son of Heaven, Semjasa. For my research, I have to admit, however, that these are only to be understood in very rough outlines and in the main and decisive points concerning the family tree, because to research and list the complete family tree would be much too costly. But what has emerged from my further research into the family tree is that before the Major of Amalfi, by whom the Hospitaller Brotherhood was founded in Jerusalem in 1048, the family tree line goes back to a man named Dyson, who was active in Israel as a Maggid, respectively, as a wandering herald about 180 years after Emmanuel. His male descendant Jeshua moved to Syria, after whose death his two male descendants moved to Medina and founded a family there. In one family 4 daughters were born, in the other 2 sons and 1 daughter. One of the sons died very young, however, while the other emigrated to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, married there, and due to the harassment of the population, took the name of his Arab wife. This marriage produced 3 daughters, but also a son who emigrated back to Israel. There he gave up the name he had taken in Mecca and called himself Major, from whose line the merchant Major from Amalfi finally emerged. Deason was a descendant of Emmanuel's son Joseph, who was born in India, but after his father's death went to Jerusalem and founded a family there, from which 2 daughters and Dyson as the only son emerged. His pedigree, in turn, logically led back to Emmanuel and to Joseph, Emmanuel's foster father and his ancestral family tree, whereby, as is well known, Emmanuel's procreation father was the son of heaven, Gabriel, whose genetic structure was naturally transferred to Emmanuel and passed on. Emmanuel's spirit form, which originated from the Nocademian line, naturally revived all the old prophets of the same line in their time, but also Semjasa, the father of Adam, who was a cousin of the ringleader Semjasa, the leader of the sons of heaven. Now, as for the Prophet Muhammad, respectively Abdul Qasim Muhammad ibn Abdullah, as his correct name was, his lineage did not trace back to your lineage, because Muhammad's birth and life took place outside your lineage, as was also the case with the prophets Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, who all came from various other lineage outside the lineage. So, apart from Emmanuel and you, the remaining 5 prophets of the Nocademion line each descend from 5 other family trees, which do not trace back to Semjasa, the father of Adam's procreation.
So it is as we suspected. My sister Berta has also been working on the family tree of the Meyer von Bulach, but she is not very far with it. At the occasion I will ask her about her results. But now I have a question, which respectively your answer is interesting for some human beings. It concerns the terms God and Goddess, which are not only used by us human beings of the earth, but also by you, but in a completely different form than with us. So you use these terms, for example, in relation to the meaning of names, but also in fairy tales, etc., as I know.
That is correct. For us Pleiaren, the terms God and Goddess have always had the meaning of an imaginary, fantastic fable creature who rules, exercises power, or protects human beings, animals and plants, or any other things. These are instructive fairy tales, respectively invented, and fantastic stories. However, imaginary mythical creatures like a god or a goddess are not real in any way, and therefore cannot be equated with a religious god or a religious goddess. Because there are no such religious or other religious fantasy figures like a god or a goddess, only creation. The terms god and goddess already lead back to the ancient history of our ancestors, to the Lyrans, who also brought these terms god and goddess together with fables, respectively fairy tales, to earth. Thus many such fables or fairy tales lead back to our ancestors as well as to us Pleiaren, whereby the earth humans have partly transformed and changed the story contents to earthly things and conditions. But back to the terms God and Goddess, which have been used equally in our languages since time immemorial, as is also the case in the German and Swiss German languages. In the German language, the term has found its original form back to God, while earth humans in all languages known to us have transformed the term God into all kinds of other terms, and it still exists today in other modified forms. In the course of time, these transformed terms gave rise to the names of God as they are used today in all earthly languages. With regard to our traditional terms God and Goddess, however, the terms God and Goddess have developed again in the course of modern times, especially from the Germanic term Gouda, which was to be understood as a bisexual, that is to say, in the form of a male and a female god. Before the Germanic term Gouda, the terms Gotu and Godan were common for God, whereby the term Wudan developed from Godan. The two terms were also used by our Lyran ancestors as God and Goddess in the same way, as it is also the case with us. That is to say, as a term for mythical creatures, respectively, fantasy creatures, which as an imaginary power stand above all things, but which are not in any way equated with creation. From time immemorial, the peoples whose origins can be traced back to Nocedemion have consciously recognized and regarded universal consciousness as the highest form of energy and power and as the origin of all existence. As a consequence, it never appeared that a god or a goddess would have been recognized or appreciated as universal creative force, respectively, as creator or creatress. A god or a goddess has always appeared as a pronounced mythical creature, or as a fantasy figure of higher power in our fables, respectively, in fairy tales, which are offered in tearful or satirical or joyful forms, mainly for children, although adults also take pleasure in such stories. Basically, these fairy tale narratives are connected with doctrinal factors, but also with legends and true events, which are embellished in the fairy tale narratives, whereby often a male or female mythical creature is interwoven, a god or a goddess. This, however, never leads us to the false doctrine of a God creator or a creator of all things. Because our children are basically taught at an early age that fairy tales and their characters, etc., are only mythical creatures, and that a god or goddess also only correspond to freely invented characters. This is why it is possible that even small children, as well as older children, can learn in a way appropriate to their thirst for knowledge through such fairy tales in which, for example, animals and creatures speak, and to which human behavior is attributed. Our fairy tale narratives in this regard are designed to contain generally accepted truths regarding the way of life and behavior of human beings, which are illustrated as practical wisdom, etc.
That probably also explains why you and your Lyran ancestors, who also come from your space-time structure, have gods and goddesses in your male and female names, which are certainly also considered mythical creatures, right?
That is indeed so.
Another thing along those lines. Do you like to remember our first encounter?
Of course, it was on the 17th of July, 1975, on your great journey. It was your 31st contact with my daughter Sim-Ya-Se.
Right. Even today I can still hear how you laughed, what sounded over the intercom throughout the ship when I said I would not fall on my knees in front of you.
Yes, I can still hear your words today because it amused me tremendously back then, and even today it is no different.
Then again, something about God. This term has consisted of 4 letters since ancient times, at least since the time of the Lyrans, your ancestors. Was it also like that before in other languages of your ancestors' respectively primeval peoples?
I can tell you that this was indeed the case, because the two terms God and Goddess go back very far. But without exception, the terms were only used in relation to imaginary mythical creatures, and that for millions of years and before our distant ancestors came to Earth. That is what we have been told.
So these terms were used by your primordial people when there were no humans on Earth, not even early humans.
I have expressed this in my words, yes.
Which I also understood. But what is interesting about God is that in most earthly languages, the terms for God also have only 4 letters, as I have listed in OM as follows. What is of even more interesting value with regard to the name God is that in all the existing languages of the earth, it is always written with only 4 letters, and that the relevant Kabbalistic calculations of these languages always evaluate the name God as death, destruction and damnation, etc. And in order to demonstrate that the name of God, the name of death and destruction, is indeed written with only 4 letters in all languages since time immemorial. Let the following brief list clarify this. The 4-letter name of God of the different peoples and languages. In Abyssinian, God means Agzi. In Aden, God means Ili. In Egyptian, God means Toth, Tiut. In Albanian, God means Bogo. In Angolan, God means Anup. In Arab, God means Allah. In Armenian, God means Abyd. In Assyrian, God means Adad. In Ethiopian, God means Abyd. In Belgian, God means Goed. In Bethulier, God means Sila. In Bohemia, God means Bueg, Berg. In Boter, God means Eris. In Braming, God means Pora. In Kamboser, God means Miri. In Karamans, God means Suna. In Chaldeans, God means Hava. In Chileans, God means Zana, Hana. In Chinese, God means Teli. In Congolese, God means Aneb, Anab. In English, God means G-O-D. In Ecuadorian, our God means Hoba, Hobo. In Etruscan, God means Isar. In French, God means Dieu. In Teutons, God means Got, Guth. In Georgians, God means Moti. In Greeks, God means Tios. In Gymniophan, God means Terra. In Hebrews, God means JHVH. In Hesperides, God means Agad. In Hibernian, God means Dik, Dia. In Illyrians, God means Bug. In Indian, God means Tusa, Tura. In Irish, God means Gudi. In Japanese, God means Zaka. In Kabbalists, God means Agla. In Californian, God means Solu. In Canadian, God means Biyud. In Copy, God means Tios. In Cretan, God means Dios. In Latin, God means Deus. In Mage, God means Orsi. In Maltese, God means Obra. In Moors, God means Allah. In Melindaher, God means Abag. In Mesopotamia, God means Ella. In Mexican, God means Bosa. In Mongols, God means Ali. In Ormusen, God means Alai. In Paraguayer, God means pure, Pino. In Parse, God means Bila. In Peloponner, God means Dios. In Persian, God means Sipi, Swirai. In Peruvians, God means Zimi. In Filipinos, God means Mora, Mara. In philosophers, God means Abda. In Phrygians, God means Zout, Zent. In Poland, God means Bug. In Russians, God means Pola. In Samaritan, God means Tios. In Saracens, God means AGDI, ABDI. In Bulkheads, God means Gut. In Spanish, God means Dios. In Tatars, God means Anat. In Thracian, God means Kalo. In Tibetan, God means Jina. In Turks, God means Adi. In Hungarian, God means Boji. In Zaliair, God means Bora. In Zelamites, God means Para. In Cyrenaica, God means Popa. But there is another question. In the USA, there are the so-called railroad tramps called hobo. But there are impossible stories about what this hobo means and where the term comes from, because the real origin and meaning is unknown. The fact is, however, that certain old railway tramps called themselves railway god, as Quetzal once told me, who had studied these hobos.
That is probably correct, because Quetzal was very intensively occupied with the railway history of the USA, and therefore also with the railroad tramps and their origin.
He also found out that the first railroad tramp was an Ecuadorian who said that as a railroad tramp, he felt like a hobo. So the term quickly spread throughout the US. And he must have known this term from Ecuador, because there God was called Hoba and Hobo.
That is correct.
One more question. Ever since I was a boy, I have come across the fact that some scientists and draftsmen depict the Big Bang in such a way that the big explosion only extends to one side, that is to say, funnel-shaped. Even as a small boy, I talked about this with your father Svath and told him that it could not correspond to reality, because I noticed something different when I was blown up. When I was allowed to work with my father at that time, and had my first blasting experiences, when we blew up tree stumps and crushed them in this way. My father was an expert in this and very responsible, because he was also a minor in the military during the Second World War on the Swiss-German border. So he knew the job of blasting inside out, and since I was already interested in this craft at that time, I consulted with him whether I could learn from him. And since I was already a student of blasting techniques at the age of 6, my father allowed me to work and learn with him, and also to experiment with black powder. For example, by hanging small explosive packages on strings from beanstalks rammed into the ground at an angle and making them explode. I found out that the explosion was not funnel-shaped, but circular and spherical, which is what I told your father. And I also told him that the universe, respectively, the creation of universal consciousness at the Big Bang, must have been created in the same way by a circular explosion, which he confirmed to me. I made the same experience when I worked as a young man for the company Thaler on Kalbermatter from Lucerne, in the artillery factory Motto Bartola at the Gotthard, and learned the trade of a mine engineer respectively, the professional blasting trade. At that time, the artillery factory was extended another time, which was already built in the 19th century. The reason for this was that in 1886 it was feared that in the event of an attack by a foreign army, the cauldron of Airolo could not yet be protected by the Fort Airolo, which was not completed until 1889. According to these fears, an immediate measure was proposed, namely a temporary artillery works on the Bartola theme. Long discussions about the location of the plant and the type of armament to be installed led to the fact that the construction works could be started in 1888. In 1890, the last works were carried out, which happened around the same time as the completion of Fort Airolo. First, the artillery installation, Motto Bartola, was set up to house one battery of 4x12 cm cannons and 4x 8.4 cm cannons for 2 batteries. For the 12 cm guns, there were stands with a pivot respectively, with a pivot axle for the frame of the gun carriage recoil brake. To understand this, it should be said that a pivot is a swivel axis of the gun barrel mounted on the gun carriage. The artillery also included a so-called ammunition casemate, respectively a rampart vault with strong rock walls, that is to say a vault secured against enemy fire. At that time the crew was calculated to be about 95-100 men. As early as 1901, several extensions and conversions were carried out, including the construction of a small war barracks, a so-called throat barracks. On both sides of the half battery stands A and B, which were already built in 1888-89. 6 individual stands were installed before the First World War, which were equipped with pivots for 12 mm guns with recoil brakes. 2 of the guns were aimed at Bedretto and 4 at Leventina. In the 1950s, when I was working in the Bartola theme, large galleries and new installations were built again.
I know all this, but you forgot to mention your question.
Oh, yes. My question should actually be whether you are aware of anything other than the fact that explosions have an all-round effect. This is also the case when there is a celebration on one side of an explosion. Such a solidity prevents the explosion from spreading all around and from having an outward effect only where everything is free.
It is not known to us other than what you also know in this respect. So if, for example, the Big Bang is represented funnel-shaped, as you say and as this journal drawing shows here, then this is fundamentally wrong. Because the Big Bang has spread as it is not possible otherwise, at the one hand circularly, and at the other hand in almost spherical form, respectively, as an egg-shaped structure.
Thanks. Then again, a question regarding the bacteria that are found up to very deep and even down to the Earth's center. Also thermobacteria, which are ultimately responsible for the fact that life formed on the Earth's surface, which developed in the water and on the wet beaches of the waters. Basically, life on Earth was created by these bacteria, which have been deep in the Earth since time immemorial and originally came to Earth through meteorites and comets, as well as through space dust. You once told me what the earthly scientists call these bacteria, etc., but I forgot the name.
They are called extremophils.
Thanks. Now we can get down to the Talmudic work.